There are seasons when faith feels small, ordinary, and unseen, yet these are often the moments where God is doing his deepest work. This reflection speaks to those who remain faithful in quiet ways, reminding us that growth does not always come through speed or visibility, but through patience, obedience, and trust in the unseen process. If you've ever wondered whether your small acts of faith truly matter, this message offers reassurance and clarity. What is faithful is never wasted, and what grows quietly often becomes great in ways you did not expect. If this exploration helped you see Scripture as a living challenge rather than distant history, we invite you to continue with my channel. So like and subscribe for future reflections where Scripture, history, and moral courage meet. And consider sharing this with someone wrestling with questions of faith, authority, or meaning. There is a quiet discouragement many people carry but rarely speak aloud. It is not the pain of failure. It is not the weight of obvious loss. It is the feeling of smallness. You look at what you are doing, what you are offering, what you are able to give right now, and it feels insignificant. Too small to change anything, too ordinary to matter, too slow to make a difference. And somewhere deep inside, a question forms quietly. Does any of this really count? This feeling does not come from rebellion. It comes from comparison, from watching others move faster, reach farther, be seen more clearly, from living in a world that measures value by scale, visibility, and immediate results. And in that world, small faith can feel invisible. But Scripture has always told a different story, not loudly, not dramatically, patiently. God's work has rarely begun with what looks impressive. It begins with obedience before understanding, with faithfulness before recognition, with small acts that appear disconnected from any grand outcome. And this is where many grow weary, not because they stop believing, but because they stop seeing the worth of what they are doing. You pray, but the prayer feels simple. You serve, but the task feels unnoticed. You remain faithful, but nothing seems to shift outwardly. And slowly, the thought settles in. Maybe this isn't enough. This is not a sign of weak faith. It is a sign of honest faith, living under constant pressure to prove itself. We have learned to associate greatness with size, big impact, big platforms, big results. But God has never measured greatness that way. Think of how often Scripture begins with the phrase, "Do not despise the day of small beginnings." Know this yourself. Not because small beginnings feel good, but because they are easy to dismiss, easy to overlook, easy to abandon, easy to underestimate. Smallness tests patience. It exposes our desire for validation. It reveals whether we trust process or only outcomes. And that is why small faith is not meaningless. It is formative. There is something sacred about faithfulness that remains quiet, about obedience that continues without applause, about trust that persists without visible confirmation. These are not weak expressions of faith. They are mature ones. You are not failing because your work feels small. You are being trained to remain faithful without needing constant evidence that it matters. And that training is not wasted. Before God multiplies, He watches for faithfulness. Before responsibility expands, character is tested. Before influence grows, obedience is refined. And refinement rarely feels exciting. This is where many misinterpret God's silence. They assume it means nothing is happening. But silence often means something is forming beneath the surface. Roots grow before fruit appears. Foundations are laid before structures rise, and both processes are quiet. If you are honest, you are not asking for greatness. You are asking for assurance that your faithfulness is not being ignored, that your effort is not in vain, that your obedience, though small, is not meaningless. And that question deserves an answer. The answer is not found in speed. It is found in direction, not in visibility, but in alignment, not in magnitude, but in faithfulness. The question is not, is this big enough? The question is this faithful? Because faithfulness, even in the smallest form, is never wasted. If you read Scripture carefully, You begin to notice a pattern that never changes. God rarely begins where people expect him to. He does not start with strength, as the world defines it. He does not wait for scale, resources, or readiness to impress. He starts with what is available, and availability often looks small. This is unsettling for those who associate God's work with immediate visibility. But it is deeply reassuring for those who feel overlooked. Consider how often God bypasses what appears obvious. A younger son instead of the firstborn, a shepherd instead of a soldier, a widow instead of the wealthy, a handful of loaves instead of abundance. Not because the greater option was sinful, but because the smaller one was surrendered. Smallness creates dependence. It removes the illusion of self-sufficiency. It prevents pride from shaping the outcome. It ensures that growth remains connected to trust. And trust is where transformation begins. When something begins small, it cannot rely on momentum. It must rely on faithfulness. It must return daily. It must remain steady. It must grow slowly. And slow growth is often the strongest kind. We are uncomfortable with slowness. We want confirmation quickly. We want signs that something is working. We want reassurance that our effort will lead somewhere visible. But Scripture teaches us that God values formation more than acceleration. Acceleration produces results. Formation produces people. And people formed through faithfulness are able to carry responsibility without losing their tucker. Integrity. Think of the mustard seed. Its power is not in its size, but in its persistence. It does not become great overnight. It does not rush its process. It simply grows. And over time, what once looked insignificant becomes a place of shelter for others. This is why small obedience matters. Not because it guarantees immediate impact, but because it shapes the kind of person who can steward impact when it comes. Small acts of faith train your attention. They teach you to notice God's presence in ordinary moments. They sharpen your sensitivity to quiet guidance rather than dramatic signs. And this attentiveness is essential. Those who are faithful in little learn how to listen. They learn how to wait. They learn how to respond without pressure. And these qualities cannot be rushed. You may feel as though you are repeating the same actions, praying quietly, serving consistently, choosing integrity in unnoticed ways. And repetition can feel unproductive, but repetition forms habit. Habit forms character, and character sustains calling. This is why God does not hurry the small. If growth came too quickly, it would bypass the inner work. It would expand responsibility without strengthening discernment, and that kind of growth rarely lasts. Small beginnings protect you from carrying more than you are ready to hold. They give you time to mature, time to learn humility, time to build resilience, and time is not wasted when it is spent in alignment. If God seems patient with your progress, it is not because he is indifferent. It is because he is intentional. He is not measuring speed. He is measuring faithfulness. You may not see how today's small obedience connects to anything meaningful, but faithfulness does not require full understanding. It requires trust. Trust that obedience, even when quiet, is being woven into something larger than you can see. There is a subtle danger hidden within the language of patience. It is the danger of mistaking waiting for obedience and stillness for faithfulness. Not every pause is holy. Not every lack of movement is trust. And yet, not every slow season is failure either. Discernment is required. Faithfulness is active. Even when it appears quiet, it is engaged. It listens. It responds. It adjusts. Stagnation, on the other hand, resists movement, even when movement is clearly invited. This distinction matters, because some people remain small out of humility. Others remain small out of fear. And the two can look identical from the outside. Faithfulness asks, "What is required of me now?" Stagnation asks, "How can I avoid risk?" Faithfulness stays attentive. Stagnation stays comfortable. God does not call everyone to visible expansion, but he does call everyone to growth. Growth in honesty, growth in obedience, growth in responsibility, and growth always involves change. Remaining faithful does not mean refusing new steps. It means taking the right ones at the right time. It means responding when clarity comes, not rushing ahead but not retreating either. Sometimes smallness is God's protection. Other times it becomes a hiding place, and only discernment can tell the difference. You may feel uncertain here. You may wonder whether your quiet life is obedience or avoidance. That question itself is healthy. Avoidance does not question itself. Faithfulness is willing to be examined. It invites truth to speak. It allows habits to be evaluated. It remains open to correction. Stagnation resists examination. It uses spiritual language to defend comfort. God's work through the small has never meant remaining unchanged. Those he calls in obscurity, he shapes for responsibility, even when the responsibility remains unseen. Think of the servants entrusted with different measures. They were not judged by comparison but by response. Faithfulness was not about scale, it was about engagement. The one who did nothing did not fail because he had little. He failed because he stopped participating, because fear disguised itself as caution. This is why growth matters even when life remains simple. You may not move outward, but you must move inward, toward deeper honesty, toward clearer obedience, toward greater trust. Faithfulness is not static. It matures, it deepens, it refines how you listen, how you respond, how you love. If you are still praying, still serving, still choosing integrity but also remaining teachable, responsive, and awake, that is not stagnation, that is formation. But if you are avoiding challenge, resisting correction, and settling into spiritual comfort, then smallness has ceased to be a beginning and has become a barrier. This is not said to pressure you, it is said to free you, because growth does not require visibility, but it does require honesty. We often assume that greater responsibility arrives with greater recognition, that when God entrusts more, life becomes louder, clearer, more impressive. But Scripture tells a quieter story. Greater responsibility rarely announces itself. It often comes disguised as consistency, as showing up when it would be easier not to, as remaining truthful when shortcuts are available, as continuing to care when no one is watching. These moments do not feel significant, but they are formative. God does not prepare people for responsibility by increasing their platform. He prepares them by deepening their integrity. Integrity is shaped in small decisions, in how you handle disappointment, in how you treat what feels routine, in how you remain faithful when progress seems invisible. These choices train you to carry weight without becoming bitter or entitled. Small faith teaches restraint. It teaches you to wait for clarity instead of forcing outcomes. It teaches you to listen before acting, and these are essential skills for anyone entrusted with influence, visible or not. Responsibility without restraint creates damage. Responsibility without humility creates harm. This is why preparation often feels slow. You may wonder why opportunities do not come faster, why recognition does not follow effort, why your faithfulness seems confined to ordinary spaces. But ordinariness is not a delay. It is a classroom. Small faith prepares you to serve others without needing to be seen. It trains you to value people over results. It teaches you to remain steady when outcomes are uncertain. And these qualities matter far more than charisma. When responsibility increases, pressure follows. Expectations multiply. Voices grow louder. Decisions carry more weight. Those unformed by small faith often crumble here. Not because they lacked ability, but because they lacked grounding. You are being grounded through repetition, through humility, through daily obedience that does not feel heroic. This is not delay. This is readiness. Greater responsibility is not always larger scope. Sometimes it is deeper care, more discernment, more patience, more attentiveness to others. And these forms of responsibility cannot be rushed. You may never be asked to do something dramatic, but you will be asked to remain faithful in moments that require maturity. And when that moment comes, what you practiced in smallness will guide you instinctively. Small faith shapes reflexes. It forms how you respond under pressure before you have time to think, and reflexes reveal formation. You are not being overlooked. You are being trained, not for visibility but for trust. Greatness, as God reveals it, rarely looks the way we imagined. It does not always arrive as expansion. It does not always come with recognition. It does not always announce itself with visible success. More often, it settles quietly. It shows up in the way you remain present when others withdraw, in the way you stay honest when exaggeration would be easier, in the way you continue to love, serve, and pray without needing proof that it matters. This is not small faith. This is faith that has matured. When God grows something slowly, He grows it deeply. Roots spread before branches rise. Strength forms beneath the surface, long before anything becomes visible. And when the time comes for fruit, it does not need to be forced. It appears naturally. You may never trace a straight line from your small obedience to something that looks great by worldly standards. But that does not mean the line does not exist. Faithfulness often works underground. Think of how many lives are steadied by people who simply remain consistent, people who listen well, who stay grounded, who do not abandon truth when it becomes inconvenient. These people rarely make headlines, but they become shelter, and shelter is a form of greatness. When the small becomes great, it is not because it stopped being small. It is because it was faithful. Faithful through repetition, faithful through obscurity, faithful through seasons when growth felt invisible. This is why Scripture never rushes the process, because rushed growth produces shallow roots, but patient faith produces resilience. You do not need to strive for greatness. You need to remain faithful. Greatness follows faithfulness in forms that cannot always be measured. Perhaps what God is growing in you will never be public. Perhaps it will never be widely acknowledged, but it will be real, and it will matter. Your quiet faithfulness may one day be the reason someone else does not give up. Your steady presence may become a place of rest for someone who is weary. Your integrity may offer clarity in a moment of confusion, and you may never know how deeply that matters. This is not a lesser calling, it is a profound one. So do not despise what feels small. Do not abandon what feels slow. Do not measure your faith by scale or speed. Measure it by faithfulness. Because in God's economy, what is faithful is never wasted, and what is grown patiently often becomes great in ways you could not have planned. Remain where you are, remain attentive, remain faithful, and trust that the small is already becoming more than you can see. One of the quiet struggles of living faithfully in small ways is learning to trust what you cannot measure. We live in a world that constantly asks for evidence. Evidence that something is growing, evidence that effort is paying off, evidence that faith is producing visible results. And when that evidence is slow to appear, doubt begins to whisper. Comparison makes this harder. It tells you that others are moving faster, that their work looks more impactful, that their faith seems more effective, and without realizing it, you begin to question not God's faithfulness but your own worth. But comparison is a poor teacher. It measures surface, not substance, visibility, not depth, noise, not formation, and it cannot see what God is shaping quietly. Much of God's work is intentionally hidden, not to frustrate you, but to protect the work from being rushed, from being shaped by approval, from being distorted by pressure. Hidden faithfulness frees you. It frees you from performing your obedience, from proving your value, from chasing outcomes you were never asked to control. And freedom is essential for healthy faith. When faith becomes a performance, it grows anxious. When obedience becomes a strategy, it grows calculating. But when faithfulness remains quiet, it stays honest. You are allowed to grow without an audience. You are allowed to mature without recognition. You are allowed to serve God without knowing how your obedience will be used. This is not a lesser path, it is a protected one. The unseen work forms trust, trust that God notices even when people do not. Trust that obedience matters even when it feels repetitive. Trust that faithfulness is not forgotten simply because it is quiet. There is a peace that comes when you stop trying to evaluate your progress constantly, when you stop asking, "Is this enough? Is this working? Should I be further along?" And instead ask, "Am I being faithful today?" That question simplifies everything. It brings faith back into the present moment. Not yesterday's success, not tomorrow's possibilities. Today's obedience. You do not need to know how the small will become great. You only need to remain faithful in the small. God carries the rest. And when growth does come, whether inwardly or outwardly, it will feel natural, not forced. Like fruit appearing in its season, like strength that surprises you because it formed quietly over time. So if your faith feels small today, do not be ashamed. If your obedience feels ordinary, do not dismiss it. If your progress feels slow, do not assume it is wasted. What is faithful is alive, and what is alive is growing even when you cannot yet see it. Remain gentle with yourself. Remain attentive. Remain faithful. And trust that the unseen work is already becoming more than you can imagine. One of the quiet challenges of faith is learning to remain faithful when nothing feels new anymore, when prayer sounds familiar, when scripture feels known, when obedience feels repetitive. Not wrong, just ordinary. We are often taught to look for renewal in what feels fresh, a new season, a new calling, a new direction. But much of spiritual maturity is formed in sameness, in choosing faithfulness when novelty fades. There are seasons when growth feels invisible, not because it has stopped, but because it has settled. Like roots that no longer break the surface, but continue expanding underground. These seasons test something important, whether you need excitement to remain faithful. Faith that depends on constant stimulation eventually grows tired. But faith that learns to live in quiet rhythms becomes resilient. There is a strength that forms when you keep praying, even when prayer feels simple. When you keep choosing integrity, even when no one notices. When you keep showing up, even when nothing feels dramatic. This strength is not loud, but it lasts. You may be tempted to interpret sameness as stagnation, but sameness can be stability. It can be a sign that your faith is no longer reacting but abiding. Abiding does not feel urgent. It feels steady. It does not rush forward. It does not pull away. It remains. This is where many underestimate what God is doing. They assume nothing is happening because nothing feels new, but depth often feels uneventful while it is forming. You are allowed to have seasons where faith is not thrilling, where obedience is quiet, where trust is practiced without strong emotion. These seasons are not failures, they are confirmations. They show that your faith is no longer dependent on feeling. Faith that survives sameness is faith that can endure difficulty, because it has learned to remain without needing constant reward. If today feels ordinary, do not rush to escape it. Ask instead, what is being strengthened here? Often, the answer is endurance. Endurance does not sparkle, but it carries you through seasons that inspiration cannot. Remain faithful even when nothing feels new. Remain attentive even when progress feels slow. Remain gentle with the pace of your own growth, because faith that remains will eventually reveal what it has been quietly becoming.